At 8 p.m. on April 7th, 2026, the world held its breath. Trump had set a deadline. Iran had to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, or face what he called the destructive force being sent tonight. Earlier that same day, he posted something almost unthinkable. A whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. That's not diplomatic language. That's not a negotiating tactic from a policy brief. That is a sitting US president threatening to erase a nation of 85 million people. And then, 90 minutes before the deadline, everything stopped. Trump announced a 2-week ceasefire. The bombs did not fall. The Strait of Hormuz would reopen. Pakistan brokered the deal. Markets exploded upward. Oil dropped 13% in a single evening. Japan's Nikkei jumped more than 2,600 points the next morning. Everyone exhaled. Everyone said, "Crisis averted. Diplomacy won." But here is what almost nobody is asking right now. What exactly did the United States agree to? And what did Iran say, quietly, almost in the same breath as the ceasefire? Because Iran's Supreme National Security Council didn't celebrate. They said something far more calculated, something that should make you pause. Our hands are on the trigger. The moment the enemy makes the slightest mistake, it will be met with full force. That is not the language of a country that just backed down. That is the language of a country that believes it just won. And then Iran's ambassador to Pakistan, one of the men in the room where this deal was made, went on state media and warned the Gulf states directly. He didn't name them, but he didn't have to. Know that sooner or later, America will leave this region by accepting defeat, and you will stay. Let that sentence sit for a moment, because that ambassador wasn't speaking to Washington. He was speaking to Riyadh, to Doha, to Abu Dhabi. He was telling the neighbors, this pause changes nothing for you. So this video is about 3 things. First, what this ceasefire actually is, and what it is not. Second, what Iran's 10-point peace proposal contains that almost nobody has read in full. Third, what the next 14 days could mean for oil markets, the Gulf states, and the broader question of who actually controls the most important waterway on Earth. This is not a victory lap story. This is a story about a pause. And pauses in wars are sometimes more dangerous than the fighting itself. If you've been following this conflict and want to understand what just happened beyond the headlines, hit like, leave a comment telling me what you think Iran's real goal is right now, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next part of this breakdown. Iran's 10-point proposal is the most important document almost nobody has read carefully. And the reason it matters is not what it offers, it's what it demands. Because when you read through the actual points that Tehran submitted via Pakistan, you start to realize that this is not a peace plan designed to be accepted. It looks more like a document designed to define Iran's opening position for a negotiation that could last years, not 2 weeks. Here is what Iran is actually asking for. First, a fundamental U.S. commitment to non-aggression, in writing, permanently. Second, Iran retains ongoing control over the Strait of Hormuz. Third, the right to continue enriching uranium for its nuclear program. Fourth, full payment of compensation and reparations for war damages. Fifth, removal of all U.S. and UN sanctions on Iran. Sixth, withdrawal of all U.S. combat forces from bases across the region. And layered through all of this, a binding UN resolution to lock in the deal. Now read that list again slowly. The U.S. wants zero enrichment. Iran's plan explicitly demands the right to enrich. The U.S. has military bases across the Gulf that have been there for decades. Iran wants every one of them gone. The U.S. imposed sanctions as leverage. Iran wants them all lifted up front. And on top of all that, Iran wants reparations, payments to compensate for a war that the U.S. and Israel started. Vice President J.D. Vance called this ceasefire a fragile truce. That may be the most honest thing said by any American official in weeks. Because here's the core problem that no one is talking about clearly. Trump called Iran's plan workable. But workable doesn't mean agreed. It means these are the pieces on the table. Now let's see who blinks first. And Iran's Supreme National Security Council made their own reading of the moment crystal clear. They released a statement saying that nearly all the objectives of the war have been achieved. They described the ceasefire as an enduring defeat for Washington. Think about that framing for a moment. Iran, a country whose military has been under sustained bombardment for 6 weeks, is publicly telling its population that it won. That's not spin for the sake of it. That's a strategic signal. It tells you something important about how Tehran reads this pause. They are not treating the next 14 days as a path to surrender. They are treating it as a window to negotiate from a position where, in their view, they have already proved they can survive. And there is a structural reason for that confidence. Iran still controls the strait. Even with the ceasefire, ships are passing through only via coordination with Iran's armed forces. Iran's foreign minister was explicit about this. There are, in his words, technical limitations. Before this war, more than 100 ships passed through per day in a long-established traffic system. No coordination required. No Iranian armed forces in the loop. Now, even under the ceasefire, Iran has inserted itself as the gatekeeper. That is not a minor detail. That is a structural shift. If that becomes the permanent arrangement, the strait has changed forever. Iran would have formalized what has always been its implicit leverage into something explicit, documented, and recognized by both sides. Iran's semi-official Tasnim news agency reported, though this remains unconfirmed by Oman, that the two countries are discussing charging transit fees for vessels, with funds earmarked for Iran's reconstruction. If that unconfirmed report turns out to be accurate, the implications are extraordinary. The world's most important oil choke point, generating revenue for the country that was just at war with the United States. In my view, this is the single most underreported aspect of the ceasefire. Everyone is talking about whether Trump backed down or won. Almost no one is talking about the fact that Iran may have quietly inserted itself into the permanent operating structure of the Strait of Hormuz. The Islamabad talks are scheduled for April 10th, just 2 days away. And the gaps between the two sides are not cosmetic. They are fundamental. Nuclear enrichment, troop withdrawal, sanctions, reparations. These are not issues that close in a 2-week window. Alex Vatanka, director of the Iran program at the Middle East Institute, put it carefully. There is potential for agreement on a basic framework, but the hard work of actually building that framework hasn't started. What this suggests is that the next 14 days are not an ending. They are the opening act of a much longer and more complicated negotiation. And the question hanging over all of it is simple. What happens when the deadline expires and the gaps are still there? Here is a fact that puts everything else in this story into sharper focus. This is not the first time Trump set a deadline for Iran and then extended it. It's not the second time. It's at least the third. On March 21st, Trump posted on Truth Social that if Iran didn't fully open the Strait of Hormuz within 48 hours, the U.S. would obliterate their military. The 48 hours passed. The deadline was extended by 10 days. Then, on March 30th, a new deadline appeared, with new threats about power plants, oil wells, and Karg Island, Iran's key oil export hub. That deadline also came and went without the threatened strikes materializing. Then came April 7th, framed publicly as the absolute final deadline. And again, 90 minutes before the clock ran out, the bombs did not fall. Now, I'm not saying Trump was bluffing. That's a conclusion I can't draw with certainty. What I can say is this. A pattern of announced deadlines followed by extensions changes how your opponent calculates risk. It changes the negotiating dynamics. And Iran's military, which dismissed Trump's threats publicly as delusional, has been watching that pattern just as carefully as everyone else. There is a real question in the room that defense analysts are now asking. Did Iran's willingness to accept this ceasefire come from a position of weakness, or did it come from a calculation that the pause benefits Tehran more than Washington? The Center for Strategic and International Studies noted something important here. The deep distrust on both sides means that even a technical agreement cannot function without verification, and Iran has not allowed IAEA inspectors into the sites struck during the war. That is not a small problem. It is the central problem. Because the entire U.S. justification for this war, the stated reason the bombs started falling on February 28th, was Iran's nuclear program and its threat to regional stability. If a peace deal does not resolve the nuclear question in a verifiable way, then the war achieved a pause, but not a conclusion. And the Arms Control Association, analyzing the pre-war talks, made a striking assessment. It is unlikely that any outcome short of complete Iranian capitulation at the negotiating table would have prevented the U.S. from going to war at all. That framing matters enormously right now, because it means the starting point of this conflict was not really a nuclear red line. It was a decision, and decisions can be revisited. But here's where the picture becomes genuinely complicated for everyone involved. The ceasefire is not universally understood the same way by all parties. Pakistan announced that the truce covered Lebanon as well as Iran. Netanyahu's office said clearly, it does not cover Lebanon. These two statements cannot both be true, and within hours of the ceasefire announcement, both Israel and the UAE sounded missile alerts, despite the declared truce. The IRGC, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, operates with significant autonomy. Individual commanders make targeting decisions. The political leadership doesn't always control them. Whether every faction inside Iran's military structure agreed to stop shooting when the Supreme National Security Council signed the ceasefire is a question that the next 14 days will answer in real time. In my view, this is the most dangerous aspect of the current moment. Not the gap between the US and Iranian negotiating positions. Those are expected. The dangerous part is the fragmentation. Multiple parties, multiple interpretations, multiple forces on the ground who were not all in the room when the ceasefire was declared. That is how temporary pauses collapse. Not through deliberate decision, but through a single commander, a single strike, a single miscalculation that neither side officially authorized, but neither side can walk back. And looming over all of it, the nuclear question that started everything. The US position, coordinated with Israel, is clear. Iran must halt all uranium enrichment, remove its stockpile from the country, and verifiably dismantle its nuclear infrastructure. Iran's position is equally clear. Enrichment is an inalienable right under international law. They are not giving it up. According to the CSIS, the US and Israeli position is that Iran can never enrich uranium on Iranian soil. Iran's position is that it will never accept that condition. Those two positions do not have a midpoint. They are not a negotiating gap. They are a structural contradiction. And the Islamabad talks beginning April 10th will have to somehow find a framework that neither side has to publicly describe as a loss. Whether that is possible in 2 weeks is a question that should keep a lot of people awake. Here is the honest summary of where things stand right now. On April 8th, 2026, the guns have stopped. The Strait of Hormuz is partially open. Oil dropped 13% overnight. Markets rallied. The headlines declared relief. And all of that is real. The pause is real. The drop in immediate danger is real. But let's be precise about what did not happen. The nuclear question was not resolved. The question of US troops in the region was not resolved. The question of sanctions was not resolved. The question of who controls the Strait of Hormuz, permanently, was not resolved. And the question of Lebanon, where Israel is still striking, was not even agreed upon between the parties claiming to broker this deal. What was agreed to is this: 2 weeks of reduced violence while negotiators from the US and Iran sit in Islamabad and try to build a framework for a permanent agreement out of 2 proposals. One 15-point American plan, one 10-point Iranian plan, that currently contradict each other on the most fundamental issues. Trump said publicly that almost all of the various points of past contention have been agreed to between the United States and Iran. Iran's Supreme National Security Council said the ceasefire does not mean the war is over. Both of those statements were made within hours of each other. They cannot both be accurate descriptions of the same reality, which means one of 2 things is happening. Either the 2 sides have radically different understandings of what they just agreed to, or one side, possibly both, is managing domestic audiences more than managing facts. In my view, the most likely explanation is something more complex than either of those. Trump needed a moment he could frame as a win before markets opened on April 8th. Iran needed to survive long enough to reach a negotiating table without being seen domestically as having capitulated to ultimatums. Pakistan needed to establish itself as an indispensable regional mediator. All 3 of those needs converged into a ceasefire that gave each party just enough to claim victory without actually resolving anything. That is not necessarily a cynical outcome. It is sometimes how catastrophic wars end. Incremental off-ramps, managed ambiguity, agreements to agree later. The question is whether the structural contradictions, nuclear enrichment, troop presence, Hormuz governance, Lebanon, can actually be resolved in a framework that both Washington and Tehran can ratify without political collapse on either side. The economic pressure to find that framework is enormous. Oil hit $119 a barrel before the ceasefire. The Philippines declared a national energy emergency. 400,000 workers in India's ceramics sector were shut down by fuel costs. Asian economies absorbing 90% of Hormuz oil flows were already straining. Capital Economics had warned of Gulf state GDP losses between 10 and 15% if the conflict continued for 3 months or more. That kind of economic pressure does not disappear because of a 2-week pause. It creates urgency, on all sides, to find something that holds longer than 14 days. But urgency and resolution are not the same thing, and the warning that Iran's ambassador gave to the Gulf states is worth returning to one more time before we close. Know that sooner or later, America will leave this region by accepting defeat, and you will stay. He was not speaking to Washington. He was speaking to Riyadh and Doha and Abu Dhabi. He was reminding the neighbors that the U.S. presence in the Gulf is not permanent. Iran's geography is. That is the long game Iran is playing inside this short-term pause. Not a military victory. Their forces have absorbed 6 weeks of sustained bombardment, but a political and psychological positioning. A message to the entire region that Iran endured, negotiated from strength, and emerged with a framework where it still controls passage through the strait. Whether that positioning holds through the Islamabad talks and through whatever comes after, that is the story of the next several weeks. And it is a story that will determine not just the future of Iran, but the future of energy markets, Gulf security architecture, and the credibility of American power projection in a region where the rules are being rewritten in real time. What we know for certain is this. On the evening of April 7th, 2026, the world came closer to a civilizational threat than most people fully processed in the moment. A 2-week pause pulled it back from the edge, but the edge is still there, and the next 14 days will tell us whether this pause becomes a foundation or just a longer fuse on the same fire. If this breakdown gave you a perspective you weren't getting elsewhere, subscribe, share this with someone who's following the story, and drop your take in the comments. Do you think the Islamabad talks can actually close the gap? Or is this pause just buying time for the next escalation? I'll be covering every development as it unfolds.